Okay, so let's dive right in. I read over the report. Unfortunately, some things were not surprising and some things were surprising. So I understand that women's visibility in construction has hit like a 20-year high, which is to say we've peaked at like 11.7, 11.4%. With that in mind, what was the most surprising like aha moment for your team when you first looked at this year's data?
That's a great question. I think one of the things that surprised our team, was the fact that this isn't just men in the industry perpetuating a bias, right? So I think people have that misconception, but the data actually complicates that assumption in an interesting way. Right? 35% of the people in C-suite position, both men and women, believe that construction will never be an ideal job for women. So that means this simply isn't a men doing this to women story. That means internalized bias is real. Um, and I think it's surprising because it means that women can perpetuate the same cultural norms that hold other women back. And that I think was a really surprising element of the data that we shared here.
Yeah, and I do have a follow-up question about that. Not just men on women bias, but like women on women bias. How do you think we can start to shift that, some of these stereotypes or internal biases at the C level or the executive level to ensure that the industry doesn't miss out on top tier talent?
I think that's another great question. I think it has to come from the top, honestly, right? People have to be very intentional about the way that they lead. Um, Construction often rewards people who are loud in the room. One of the other statistics was around the number of women in leadership. And so if is a lack of women in leadership positions, there aren't enough women to advocate for other women. And I think that perpetuates some of that issue, right? Where if um, if there aren't enough women in leadership and there aren't enough people holding space for advocating or sponsoring or mentoring other women, it makes it a really tough thing. And then those cultural norms just continue to kind of fester because there aren't people leading from the top and leading that change.
Yeah, absolutely. And if we think of mentorship versus sponsorship, I know that in the report, 33% of women cited a lack of female leadership as a barrier to getting adequate mentorship. So, in your words, what is the difference between mentorship and sponsorship, and how can we move beyond mentorship into active sponsorship?
So sponsorship in my mind is like actively advocating for someone, not just advising them. Mentorship is advising, right? Like giving, helpful directional career advice, and both are really important. But sponsorship is actively advocating for women to move forward. And I think where leaders can make a real difference is by participating in that shift, like auditing informal networks. Like one of the things that our data shows is that advancement, they think that it's happening in shared informal spaces. So if you're a leader, you should be asking yourself, like, who is and isn't in the conversation when you're in those informal spaces, the golf course, a happy hour, in a group text. Where can you sponsor and actively advocate for other women in the industry, and make sure that there is room to grow. Also, being explicit about there's room to grow here, right? Like just saying that there's room to grow is not enough. Being really deliberate about documenting the criteria that is required to get to that promotion is really important. And I think women leaders can play a really active role in that. So that
Absolutely.
us get lost, right?
Yeah, I was at a summit 2 weeks ago and they said that men come to the table with potential and women have to come to the table with accomplishments, like already accomplished. And I thought that was very telling. In terms of celebrating assertive female leadership, what is one thing you think that maybe C-level construction executives, all the way to down to boots on the ground, could do tomorrow to encourage women leaning in rather than viewing each other as a competition?
Well, great question.
Because it's true, right? Women tend to see upward mobility as a limited resource or a finite resource, and I don't find that men do. So
Yeah. I think, I think encouraging each other starts with just encouraging each other. Not seeing each other as competition, again, I think goes back to having very clear documented expectations for how you can grow. And so, I hate to keep going back to the top, but I think leadership can really has the most culpability there. They have to be holding themselves accountable for making sure that people understand what that path looks like, and having that clarity will help, I think, eliminate some of that feeling of competition. The other thing I was going to say is, you know, again, construction is a very visible industry. Like our CEO, Vias, has been very vocal that this starts with a transparent kind of culture, clearer career paths, accountability. But from a technology standpoint, like we genuinely believe that workflows and performance are documented and data driven. And so advancement becomes less dependent on who you know or whether you're in the right rooms or the right after hours conversations when those things are visible. So if your results are documented, it levels the playing field for everyone. And so I think as women, I would encourage everybody to not be shy about finding opportunities to make sure that your impact and what you're doing for the organization is visible, whether that's tangible in the field or something in the back office. The way that your work is impacting the organization is really important. And it's unfortunate that we have to be loud and vocal about it, but that visibility levels the playing field in a way that I think is really important and meaningful. And I think, again, those results and making them visible will help eliminate some of that natural kind of competition.
Yeah, we're tired of words. We want demonstrative action. One thing that surprised me in the report for 2026 is that 30% of Gen Z and millennials are still being forced to wear ill-fitting PPE or equipment. Do you think this is a supply chain issue or a sign that inclusive safety isn't really being prioritized in project budgets?
Probably a little bit of both. Honestly, and that's probably, that's not an area of expertise that I have. And that was a surprising kind of element that also came out of the study, but I would assume it's a little bit of both. I mean, the PPE supply chain issues seem to have been perpetuated even beyond what we experienced in the height of COVID. And so I would expect that some of that is a carryover. But also, I think firms are likely not planning for this as well as they should be.
Yeah. No, I would agree with that. Also, if we think of millennials and the Gen Z cultures, the data showed a massive gap in how women experience mansplaining. I think it was 45% of Gen Z and 27% of millennials. So, why do you think our youngest generation is feeling this friction so much more acutely?
I think they're more aware of it, right? They're sensitive. They're sensitive, and their senses are heightened. And I think the very concept of mansplaining and some of those more common or more slang things are just out in the open more. And I think it's okay to talk about them more in today's culture. And so I think that's part of it. But there's just a prevalence of it that I think is different in today's
Yeah.
environment than there has been.
Yeah, I agree. I have Gen Z kids, so they're talking about their mental health so much more than my generation ever did. It was also interesting to me that 1 in 5, like 20%, reported feeling most unsafe when not reporting, I guess, harassment or safety concerns because they didn't want to lose their jobs. From a leadership standpoint, how can companies build like a psychologically safe culture where reporting is seen as a strength and not a risk?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think you can't fix it all at once. I think there's a lot of opportunity in the safety environment. Those conversations are happening, all over the place all the time, where women are, feeling like it's a joke a lot of times,
Yeah.
and there's nothing funny about it. When they're afraid about losing their jobs, the silence in not reporting that is the real safety issue, I think. And so what can leadership do about that? I think making it safe is a really tough thing to do. But there's got to be a way to combat that silence. And I think there are maybe unique ways to do that in the field versus different ways to do that when it's in the back office. And I'm not sure that anybody's cracked the code on that yet, but I think there has to be an emphasis on, just like there has been, like you were saying, on mental health. There has to be an emphasis on safety, and I think unfortunately safety for most firms has meant, physical safety, right? Like the PPE and the people on roofs and all of the reporting that is necessary for OSHA. So I think there has to be a shift from leadership to acknowledge that safety is also the unseen and the silence that is happening on the harassment side, and making sure that there are avenues where people feel comfortable enough to speak up.
Yeah. In terms of shifting priorities, I know that about 70% of Gen Z women reported struggling to advance their careers. And we know from some of the data that recruitment is no longer the main bottleneck. So I'm wondering if you could speak to the specific, or maybe hypothesize on the specific design flaws in the current promotion systems that need to be fixed to keep these women in the industry, because it's not just about hiring now, it's about retention.
I think you're right. The one thing, it's very clear that the industry has a labor shortage. And so women have a unique, if we're not acknowledging that women have a huge impact to help solve for that shortage, that's kind of the hiring side of that. But getting them in is only half the battle, as you're referencing right now. Retention is going to be an even greater challenge, and probably even more important, because all of these issues that we're talking about today, safety, advancement, leadership, mentorship, sponsorship, all of those challenges now compound once somebody is there. Having to solve for those means they're even more important in getting women to stay in the industry and have a real successful career. And so I think, retention is going to be the greatest challenge to solve. It's going to take collaboration, it's going to take communication, and it's going to take, both men and women working together to solve for those changes. Again, I think the culture and the challenges have to come from change at the top. And that's, I think, going to be the biggest challenge in kind of influencing that retention piece.
Yeah, and it's uncomfortable because it requires the dismantling of some major power structures, and people have to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and sitting in that. And it's not gonna happen tomorrow, but I think you're right. I know that about a third, maybe just under a third, of the respondents in your survey believe that changing that boys' club mansplaining culture would be the biggest catalyst for women joining the field. So, from your experience at Stack, it seems like there's a potential for technology and standardized workflows to help level the playing field and maybe reduce reliance on these informal networks. Could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah, one thing I think that is really exciting about what we saw from the report is that there are some bright spots, right? Like, I think there are things to be optimistic, and what you're speaking to is one of them. What you can't overlook is that there is a problem, and now we need to move to how we can fix it. And the growth of offsite opportunities, in places like pre-construction, estimating, project management, leadership, that means that there's this wide open kind of field of underrepresented opportunities for women. And I think as tech adoption accelerates, that's just going to grow. And that alone, I think, shifts some of that bias, right? Where people think of construction as just boots in dirt. And that idea alone, I think, just contributes to the bias of women in construction. The mass influx of technology widens the gap in terms of all of the different ways that women can contribute to the industry. The pipeline is there. The industry just has to be ready to receive it. And women are poised to fill positions like that. They communicate well, they problem solve, in amazing ways, and they're ready to do it. These positions are here and ready to fill them. The labor shortage is not confined or contained to just the field work. And so, yeah, I think there's a huge opportunity for technology to really help us advance the fix for this problem.
Yeah, I was reading by 2029, we'll have about a 500,000 shortage of labor across the AEC, which is mind boggling. So you're right. I think Stack is well positioned. I know your CEO had talked about moving from talking about inclusion to measuring it. You are well positioned with all of the data sets you have to really make demonstrative change. So what do you think are the top three metrics you think every construction firm should be tracking this year to ensure they're actually making progress?
I think they should be tracking their hiring. What does their hiring look like? And not just hiring, for DEI, right? Like not just hiring for diversity, but truly hiring with the intention to shift this challenge and make sure that they're hiring to make better decisions, right? There's women bring different perspectives to problem solving and safety culture and communication on job sites. So hiring, I think, is one of them. Retention is another one. Employee retention in general, not just in the face of what we're talking about in terms of women in construction, but employee retention is really challenging. There are safety issues in construction. There are mental health issues in construction. And so I think tracking retention in general is really important. And then I think upward mobility is another thing that I would be tracking. That alone will force firms to, again, go back and be very intentional about documenting and being very clear about what the criteria is to advance, and then tracking that will hold them accountable.
Yeah, I think that's great. I wanted to ask one last question, and this kind of goes back to our conversation about labeling women with gendered stereotypes. I know that a surprising percentage of women in the C-suite are perceived as bossy or aggressive. How do you think we can encourage a culture that celebrates assertive female leadership rather than labeling or dismissing it?
Yeah. Some of those findings definitely hit close to home. I've been in rooms where I've had to work really hard to establish credibility differently than my male counterparts, did than just walking in the room. And so that stat, that 41% of women who reported that, definitely resonated. There's a calibration that women are constantly doing, where you have to balance the ability to be direct with, enough to be taken seriously, but not too much so that you're not triggering a reaction. And so I think there's an opportunity for women to continue to be a voice. The perception of being bossy or aggressive isn't negative. There's aggressive and there's assertive, and those words are very closely related. And I think there is just an opportunity for women to advocate that assertiveness is okay. There are literally situations where I've personally been in where men and women are saying the exact same thing and almost using identical words, and one is just perceived differently. And I think there are opportunities for us to just point those things out and to just be more observant about how people are using words in both genders and seeing the same results. You wouldn't expect for a man to rephrase something just to make people more comfortable. And I think it's important for women to call that out when it's appropriate.
Almost wish there was a script so that when some male counterpart tries to mansplain or label you, you could say, like, what did you mean by that? Was that meant to belittle me, or something for another article, perhaps?
Yeah, that's a great point. I mean, asking the question, asking for intention sometimes is the best way to get somebody to reflect on what it was that they actually meant by
Yeah,
that.
and giving it back to them, saying, you own this, I don't own this. Is there anything that you want to tell our readers about Stack, the work you're doing, future work, and maybe current state?
I want to be clear that I am genuinely optimistic. I think, the industry is one of the most important in the world. It is one of the most economically resilient fields out there. The opportunity for women to build long, well-compensated careers is genuinely significant. I am really thrilled to be at the center of the technology boost that is going to help women to expand their opportunities to grow in the field. And I'm really proud of Stack for taking kind of the reins on making sure that the women in construction issues are surfaced and shared.